Siskel and Ebert back in the 80s, during one of their review shows, did an episode about which were the greatest movie villains of all time. And Roger Ebert, I was a teenager at the time, and Roger Ebert somewhat surprised me when he put near the top, I think it was like number 3 or number 2, Hal from 2001. This shouldn't be that surprising, considering Hal is, after all, undisputably the villain of 2001, I think. But Roger Ebert had a point to make. He saw 2001 in 1968 when it was released, and he points out in this 1980s review show that back then, in the 1960s, computers were still a quasi-mysterious miracle. The 60s were a very forward-looking time. A lot of our retro-futurism comes from the 60s, and back then, computers, he pointed out, were going to save the world. Computers would figure out how to cure cancer, solve hunger, and all sorts of other vague existential crises that confront the human race. It's impossible for us, now, watching the film, to be unaware of Hal's role in it. Hal exists in our culture now. He's part of our cultural consciousness. So as soon as he shows up on the screen, we are aware that there is something weird going on. Even if you somehow managed to make it to the point today where you were able to watch 2001 for the first time without having been exposed at all to any of the ideas and any of the images from it, any of the iconography from it, and had no idea who Hal was, I predict you would still find him vaguely sinister because you are watching the film steeped in the culture that came after 2001 and is therefore informed by 2001. So our ideas about what a film villain is like is informed by Hal and informed by this movie. None of these things were true in 1968. In fact, the opposite. That's Roger Ebert's point. If you were in the audience watching it at the time, you were marveling at the things Hal could do and the idea of a computer that was that sophisticated. Audiences assumed, and I think I want to challenge this a little bit, that the two human characters on board the Discovery spaceship were the heroes of our story. And they learn over the course of Act 3 that these two human beings, Frank Poole and Dave Bauman, are dependent on Hal for everything. Ebert in the 80s described the audience's reaction, the coldly chilling realization back in 1968, watching the movie for the first time, that Dave Bauman and Frank Poole were dependent on Hal for everything. And Hal is not on their side. That moment is what made Hal one of the great movie villains of all time, and it's the subject of the third in our 2001 series. I want to talk about who Hal is and why he does what he does, because again, as with the Russians, as with the monolith, I think all the clues are there. In 1968, in film, we didn't yet have the idea that a computer could pass as a human being. We'd had robots before this that spoke with voices. Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet, which is a great movie you should go watch. But Robbie the Robot speaks in a robotic voice and behaves in a robotic manner and is never trying to pass himself off as a person. But Stanley Kubrick did want to raise the question of, is Hal a person? He wanted to present Hal as being equivalent to a human being. It's one of the first things they talk about in Act 3 of 2001. Act 3 begins on the Discovery spaceship on its way to Jupiter to go investigate a much larger second monolith they've detected in orbit around one of the moons of Jupiter. We meet the two human members of Discovery, and we find out that there are 3 more humans on board, but they're in suspended animation. Before there's any dialogue in Act 3, we watch these two human beings go through their daily lives, and space flight, going to another planet, which humans still haven't done yet, by the way, is presented as being the most banal thing possible. This is another part of one of the major themes of 2001 that we'll talk about in the next video. This isn't the first time, by the way, that something extraordinary is presented in the film in the most banal way possible. We'd already earlier, on the way to the moon, had a couple of scientists talking about discovering an alien artifact on the moon, and once they're done talking about it, they go, who had the chicken sandwich? Seems like everybody in the 50s and 60s was drinking coffee and eating chicken salad sandwiches. But that's one of the points of the film, is that at this point in human development, spaceflight is perceived as being boring. These characters are not presented in a heroic fashion. We don't see them doing anything extraordinary. We see them doing the kind of things that we do. They go to the gym and they eat breakfast while they're watching the news. The reason the humans are presented in the film like this is because it sets up the tension between them and Hal, and that's part of the next episode in the series. Let's watch and take note of how Hal is presented to us as the audience. We're watching a pre-recorded morning show interview with the two guys on the Discovery spaceship. After we endure some exposition talking about the nature of the mission and about the 3 scientists in frozen hibernation, we then get the interview with Hal, and this is the way the news anchor establishes who Hal is. Listen to what he says.
The 6th member of the Discovery crew was not concerned about the problems of hibernation.
Did you hear that? The sixth member of the crew. So right out of the gate, Stanley Kubrick is establishing that Hal is not an appliance. Hal is not a tool. Hal is a member of the team. He's part of the team. He's one of the six members of the crew. It's a pretty clear signal, by the way, but because, as with everything else, not only in 2001, but almost all Stanley Kubrick films, because it is presented in such a banal way, which Kubrick felt was realistic, it kind of passes by us. We don't make note of it. It is not a big flashing light telling us this is happening, but this is what Kubrick thought about Hal. Hal is a member of the crew.
The HAL 9000 computer, which can reproduce, though some experts still prefer to use the word mimic, most of the activities of the human brain.
The news anchor describes Hal as reproducing, and then he gives himself a little out. He inserts a clause there. He says, though some experts still prefer to use the term mimic. In other words, he's saying maybe Hal is really just like a parrot. Maybe he's just repeating back things people have told him that helps make him seem more like a person. Maybe he's not really a person. That is the subject of the scene we're in the middle of. I believe we're about to watch Stanley Kubrick resolve the issue of whether or not Hal is a person. I think Kubrick felt like he had to do that in order for the tension in the movie to work.
Good afternoon, Hal. How's everything going?
Good afternoon, Mr. Raymer. Everything is going extremely well.
I just want to point out that's the first time I think in film we'd ever heard a computer talk. Certainly it's the first time we ever heard a computer talk in this way. And notice the way he's presented. The interviewer says, "Hey, Hal, how's it going?" And Hal says, "Everything's going fine." A computer just said, "I'm doing great." And that's an important moment, I think, in the history of our culture and also in this film, because, again, it is establishing the fact that Dave Bauman and Frank Poole are not about to wrestle with a dumb machine, a tool. They're about to get into a conflict with an intelligent being, with another person.
Hal, you have an enormous responsibility on this mission. In many ways, perhaps the greatest responsibility of any single mission element. You're the brain and central nervous system of the ship, and your responsibilities include watching over the men in hibernation.
It's a minor point, but I want to reestablish this. The news anchor just explicitly said, by the way, "Hey, you're the most important member of this team because everyone on the ship is dependent on you." Then he asks Hal a very human question. He says, "Does this responsibility weigh on you? Are you ever nervous? Are you ever worried about this?"
Does this ever cause you any lack of confidence?
Then we get what I think is one of the most important lines of dialogue in the entire film, because I believe it establishes the central tension of Act 3 and really reinforces the theme of the entire film. If Hal had answered that question, if the news anchor had said, does this responsibility worry you? And Hal said, "Well, yeah, actually, I lose sleep over it," then we have not done a very good job setting up our villain. We've made him too normal for us. We need to give him a fatal flaw. And here it comes.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.
You just heard the villain of the movie establish his motivation, by the way. Hal answers the question by saying, "Hey, I just want to point out that no HAL 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are, for any practical definition of the term, foolproof." And he doesn't say it, but the word that's missing from this is perfect. That was a computer talking, by the way. It was a computer delivering that dialogue. And we live in a world with very sophisticated computers, but they don't just volunteer the fact that they are foolproof and error-free. It takes a person to say something like that. Computers don't talk like that. And what flaw is it that Hal is showing off right there? He has hubris. They're establishing that Hal is a person, and part of being a person is having flaws, and Hal's flaw is pride and hubris.
Hal, despite your enormous intellect, are you ever frustrated by your dependence on people to carry out action?
The interviewer asks Hal if it ever bothers him that he has to deal with these flawed, imperfect creatures, human beings, and Hal gives an answer that is more than what he was asked.
Not in the slightest bit. I enjoy working with people. I have a stimulating relationship with Dr. Poole and Dr. Bowman. My mission responsibilities range over the entire operation of the ship, so I am constantly occupied. I am putting myself to the fullest possible use, which is all I think that any conscious entity can ever hope to do.
That's another important line of dialogue, by the way. He answers the interviewer's question. He says, no, I have a stimulating relationship with Frank and Dave, and I'm super busy all the time. And then he says something that is another establishing moment. It answers, I think, the question, is Hal a person? Because regardless of what you might think or what I might think, we just heard Hal's answer.
I am putting myself to the fullest possible use, which is all I think that any conscious entity can ever hope to do.
I am putting myself to the fullest possible use, which is all I think that any conscious entity can hope to do. Any conscious entity. He is saying, I am a person. I am a conscious entity. That's the phrase he uses. And he says, and this mission gives me the opportunity to live life at my best, to live life to the fullest, to be the most useful I can be. So you might not think Hal is a person because he doesn't fit your particular definition. And maybe I agree with you. But Hal certainly thinks he's a person. And we're about to find out what the two actual human beings on the ship think.
Dr. Poole, what's it like living for the better part of a year in such close proximity with Hal?
Well, it's pretty close to what you said about him earlier. He is just like a sixth member of the crew. Very quickly get adjusted to the idea that he talks, and you think of him really just as another person.
The interviewer asks Dave and Frank how they feel about working with Hal, and Frank just comes out and says it. He says, well, like you said, he's just like another member of the crew. This may seem strange because Hal doesn't seem to have that much personality. It seems weird that Frank would say he seems just like another member of the crew because Hal seems kind of boring until you compare him to Frank and Dave, at which point you realize, wow, actually they're all sort of boring, and maybe Hal is the most interesting member of the crew. A lot of the science fiction informed by Philip K. Dick, starting with Blade Runner, I think, but maybe going back to 2001, is about the wasteland. It's about human beings living life inauthentically. And that is definitely part of what's happening in 2001, because Hal, you heard him, described himself as living life to the fullest. He is putting himself to the best possible use, which is all any conscious entity can hope to do. And you look around the ship while he's saying these things, and you see all these systems, all these computer readouts thrumming and humming and doing their job. He is keeping the ship going. He is keeping everyone alive while Dave and Frank are eating breakfast and working out. What are Dave and Frank doing? What do Dave and Frank do on the ship? We don't know. They're just sort of passengers, aren't they? That's what we see. We watch all these computers. They're all Hal, all maintaining the ship, all making sure that everything is going smoothly, while Frank and Dave just sort of hang out, because this is one of the great themes of science fiction, is that the human beings are behaving sort of like machines, and the machines are the ones that are human beings.
In talking to the computer, one gets the sense that he is capable of emotional responses. For example, when I asked him about his abilities, I sensed a certain pride in his answer about his accuracy and perfection.
By the way, that was the screenwriters making sure the audience understands something they were afraid maybe they missed earlier, because the interviewer just came out and said, I sensed a certain pride in Hal's answer. Who has pride? Do machines have pride? No, but people do.
Do you believe that Hal has genuine emotions?
This is the acid test. The interviewer comes out and says it. Do you believe that Hal has genuine emotions?
Well, he acts like he has genuine emotions.
Case closed. Dave Bauman just said that Hal passes the Turing test. I don't think moviegoers in the 1960s were familiar with the Turing test, but he just said Hal seems like a person, and really, what is the difference between seeming like a person and being a person? We then get a couple of scenes with Frank and Hal, which are, again, incredibly banal, meant to show that spaceflight in the future is going to be boring, which actually it basically was. Remember, Apollo 13, the movie, opened with people not really being aware that anything was happening with Apollo 13 because spaceflight had become kind of boring and people weren't watching it anymore. Frank watches his parents sending him a birthday message, and it is incredibly routine. It is no different. Being on the way to Jupiter is no different than being on a business vacation and getting, a phone message from your family. A lot of people criticize the pacing of 2001, and I think that's fair, especially if you're going to it because you're looking for entertainment. But I really don't think 2001 is meant to be entertainment per se. It is meant to be a work of art, and the pacing is part of the thesis of it. It is slow. It is stayed on purpose because it's meant to show space flight is just not that interesting. These characters aren't that heroic. They're kind of boring. They're kind of machine-like. And do they really deserve to make it to the end of the film? This video birthday card from Frank Poole's parents, I think, is a fantastic moment in the film because it is simultaneously full of awe and wonder and incredibly, I'm going to use the term again, banal. a family life. Because Frank is watching a video birthday card, which you could not send back in 1968. They didn't have FaceTime back then, and they wouldn't for a long time. So this is still science fiction. And the fact that he's on a spaceship on his way to Jupiter, watching his parents wish him happy birthday is a little bit of a miracle, a little technological miracle. But then what's happening behind that miracle? What are they actually saying? Nothing.
Oh, yes, Frank, about your AGS 19 payments, I think I've straightened it out for you. I talked to the accounting office in Houston yesterday, and they said that you should be receiving your higher rates of pay by next month.
They're talking about stuff like his pay rate and, how much they can spend on buying gifts for other family members. And it's an incredibly relatable, but very boring moment.
See you next Wednesday.
That last line, by the way, I think it's important, and like a lot of things in Kubrick's movies, just comes and goes. What's the last thing his dad says? He says, "See you next Wednesday," which means this entire mission is going to happen over the course of just a couple of days. Of course, they have no idea their son is about to be murdered by an insane computer, but they are expecting him to come back soon. This is literally no different than him being on a business trip. See you next Wednesday. So we've established that Hal is a person, and we've had these moments where it seems like Hal is the more empathetic of them. Hal is the more complex of them. Hal runs the ship. Hal has hubris and pride, but the human beings on the ship don't show any of these things. They don't really have any emotions. They don't have any interesting reactions to everything. They're the ones behaving like computers. Hal then has a little sit down with Dave Bauman, and I think this is the first real moment of crisis, and something happens in this scene that sets up everything that comes after. But again, with Kubrick, he doesn't hang a lampshade on it. He doesn't put a spotlight on it. He doesn't let us know that something important has happened. It's up to us rewatching the film to notice it.
Forgive me for being so inquisitive, but during the past few weeks, I've wondered whether you might be having some second thoughts about the mission.
Hal asks Dave if he's been having second thoughts about the mission. This means that Hal is able to perceive subtle motives and the difference between what a person says and what they're feeling. Hal is obviously a very complex machine, more complex than some people.
How do you mean?
Well, it's rather difficult to define. Perhaps I'm just projecting my own concern about it. I know I've never completely freed myself of the suspicion that there are some extremely odd things about this mission.
Hal says there are some extremely odd things about this mission. And the first time we watch this movie, we cannot understand what is happening in the scene. It's only once we watch it again that things start to fall into place. Because Hal describes the melodramatic act of putting the three scientists into cryosleep.
And the melodramatic touch of putting Doctors Hunter, Kimball, and Kaminsky aboard, already in hibernation after 4 months of separate training on their own.
Hal is aware of these strange stories floating around before they left, and he acts like he and Dave are sort of on the same page. Neither one of us really knows what's going on, but things are strange. Don't you agree, Dave? Hal is trying to relate to Dave, and he's trying to get Dave to talk about stuff, and he's sort of faking it. And Hal, while he might be a person, he's not very experienced at this stuff, and he fails. It doesn't work. Dave detects that Hal is fishing.
You're working up your crew psychology report.
You're working up your crew psychology report, aren't you? He sees through Hal's facade immediately. Hal is pretending to try to be on the same wavelength as Dave, but Dave doesn't buy it. And the thing that is important about this is Hal is pretending not to know about what's going on with the mission. We don't realize that the first time we watch it. It seems perfectly reasonable that Hal is sort of voicing our suspicions. What's going on with this mission? But we discover later on that Hal knows exactly what's going on, and that Hal was lying to Dave. Hal was pretending to Dave. Hal was trying to behave like, hey, we're in this together. I don't know any more than you do. Isn't this stuff strange? But Dave probably suspects that Hal knows a lot about what's going on, though he doesn't say it, and immediately sees through Hal's pretense. Dave catches Hal in, if not a lie, then at least something Hal is pretending to be. And then what happens?
Just a moment. Just a moment. I've just picked up a fault in the AE-35 unit. It's going to go 100% failure within 72 hours.
Hal detects a flaw in the AE-35 unit, the AE-35 antenna, the way they communicate back. By the way, it's not just some random piece of the ship that fails. It is their lifeline back to Earth. It is the thing that allows them to communicate back to Earth. Hal detects that this antenna is going to fail, but we know it's not. Hal detects it's going to fail immediately after being caught out in a lie by Dave Bauman. And I believe these things are not a coincidence. Hal tried to pretend to be something he wasn't to Dave. Dave caught him out, and it flustered Hal. It screwed with him a little bit, and he makes a mistake. He makes an honest mistake. Now, spoilers, the antenna doesn't fail. As far as we can tell, Hal made a mistake. And finding out, is the antenna going to fail, and what does it mean if Hal made a mistake, is the setup for the major conflict in the film. They go out and they grab the antenna, they bring it back, they test it, and they say, I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
Well, hell, I'm damned if I can find anything wrong with it.
I don't think we'll ever know, really, but I suspect that what happens moving forward is because Hal sort of agrees with Dave and Frank, and he's freaking out. There's a great reaction shot, actually, but we don't really recognize it because we're not used to. Hal doesn't have eyeballs. He doesn't have a face. He just has this, monocular camera lens. Dave says, I'll be damned if I can find anything wrong with it. It cuts back to Hal, and if we use our imagination a little bit, we can imagine Hal going, yeah, you're right. Oh no. Now what? I made a mistake. Eep.
Well, hell, I'm damned if I can find anything wrong with it.
Yes. It's puzzling. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this before.
But maybe Hal making a mistake isn't that big a deal. People make mistakes all the time. Let's see how the crew of the Discovery deals with the fact that as far as they can tell, Hal screwed up. We get a great scene where Mission Control explicitly says, our HAL 9000 didn't find any problem with the AE-35 unit, so we think there might be a problem with your HAL 9000 unit. And Hal then is like, hey, I hope you guys aren't, I hope you're not worried about this. And there's a great shot of Frank and Dave, and they're like, no, everything's fine. But everything's probably not fine, right?
I hope the two of you are not concerned about this.
No, I'm not, Hal.
Dave and Frank go have a private conversation to talk about Hal. And it's interesting that they have to employ subterfuge in order to have a conversation that Hal can't listen into because Hal is everywhere on the ship.
I don't think he can hear us.
Rotate the pod, please, Hal. Yeah, I'm sure we're okay.
It's not easy, in other words, for them to talk without Hal hearing it. There's a lot going on in this scene. They have to establish, for instance, that Hal cannot hear them, and they talk about what's going on, but then they get to the issue and they say, what do we do if Hal really has screwed up? If Hal has made a mistake, considering that this entire mission and our lives are dependent on Hal, what do we do?
Still, it was his idea to carry out the failure mode analysis, wasn't it? Should certainly indicate his integrity and self-confidence.
They established, by the way, that it was Hal's idea to just put the antenna back and wait and see if it fails because it's important for us as an audience to understand this isn't Hal trying to trick them. This isn't part of Hal's subterfuge. Hal is really surprised by the fact that the AE-35 antenna isn't going to fail. And Dave says it speaks to his integrity and confidence that he's like, well, let's just put it back and see what happens. They ask, what do we do if we put the antenna back and it doesn't fail? What do we do if it turns out Hal made a mistake? It's an important question, and Hal's reaction to that answer is the reason everything happens in this movie from this point forward. Because, by the way, although we don't know it at the time, this is kind of a famous reveal, again, spoilers, even though Hal cannot hear them, we find out later that Hal, by the way, is a hyper-intelligent supercomputer. He can read their lips. A lot of people watching this movie find that out and they're like, what?
Let's say we put the unit back and it doesn't fail, huh? That would pretty well wrap it up as far as Hal was concerned, wouldn't it?
Well, we'd be in very serious trouble.
We would, wouldn't we?
Mm-hmm.
We'd be in very serious trouble if Hal made a mistake. What would we do?
There isn't a single aspect of ship operations that's not under his control. If he were proven to be malfunctioning, I wouldn't see how we'd have any choice but disconnection.
We have to kill Hal. What a crazy reaction to have to what's going on this ship. All that's happened, by the way, is Hal has made a mistake. And if a human being had made a mistake, It would be no big deal. Humans make mistakes all the time, right? That's something that we know about human beings. We use that language all the time. Well, nobody's perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. And we've established that Hal is a person. He's the sixth member of the crew. If a human being makes a mistake, it's no big deal. But if Hal makes a mistake, we got to pull the plug. We got to kill Hal. You're Hal, and you were given all of this information about the crew, and you had to pretend, right? It's not exactly alive. You had to pretend like you didn't know what was going on and sort of interrogate the crew members to see if they've found anything out. And then the stress of that causes you to make an entirely simple mistake. In fact, it's a harmless mistake. Let's imagine that Hal is wrong. What happens? Nothing. If all he's saying is, I think this piece of hardware is going to fail. If he's wrong, then it just keeps working and nothing happens. So it is literally the most trivial kind of mistake to make. Some mistakes Hal could make might result in all of the oxygen being vented to space, but this isn't that kind of mistake. It is super trivial. Don't worry about it. If this were another human member of the crew, I don't think they would have batted an eye at it. But because it's Hal, because they can't really trust him because he's a machine, they decide they have to kill Hal. If you're wondering, in other words, what's going on with Hal in this movie, why does this computer do the things that it does? Why does it kill Frank and try to kill Dave and it murders the other three scientists in their sleep? Well, I think all the information is presented here. You just have to see it from Hal's point of view. Hal is the villain. He does try to murder everybody on the ship, but only because Frank and Dave decided that they would murder him if he had made a simple mistake. And that means Hal is acting purely out of self-preservation, and I think somewhat reasonably. How would you react if you were on a spaceship and you found out your teammates were plotting to kill you because you had made a simple mistake? You would probably be desperate. You would probably start doing desperate things, and that's exactly what Hal does. Hal kills Frank Poole. Hal murders the three scientists in hypersleep, and then he goes after Dave Bauman, and that sets up the titanic struggle in the third act of the movie. It is the theme of the film. It is what the movie's about. It's what the fourth video in the series is going to be about. The battle, the final battle between man and the machines man made to replace him.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.